No one walked into that theater expecting history. They thought they were buying a ticket to escape for 2 hours, not to watch the future quietly rearrange itself in front of their eyes. But when the lights went down, something irreversible had already begun, hadn't it? At the time, America didn't feel like a place waiting for heroes. It felt tired, suspicious, and hollowed out by promises that had collapsed under their own weight. So why did a simple space fantasy arrive exactly then? And why did it hit so deeply? The mid-1970s were heavy years, not dramatic in the way wars are dramatic, but heavy in the way exhaustion settles into a society's bones. Vietnam was over, yet it hadn't ended. Watergate had passed, but trust never came back. Factories slowed, cities decayed, and optimism became something people remembered rather than felt. And somewhere inside that quiet unraveling, people were still lining up for movies. But what were they hoping to see? Hollywood itself was unsure of what it was supposed to be. The old studio system was broken. New filmmakers were experimenting, deconstructing heroes, tearing down myths instead of building them. Movies were cynical, intimate, and often bleak. Audiences applauded the honesty. But did honesty alone satisfy? A generation that had lost its sense of direction. In theaters, protagonists failed. They doubted. They broke. They reflected reality all too well. And yet outside the screen, something else was happening. Something quieter, harder to measure. A hunger wasn't being fed. But what kind of hunger asks for nights, myths, and galaxies far away? Television news delivered daily reminders of corruption and decay. Newspapers spoke in the language of disillusionment. Parents warned their children to be realistic. Dreams were framed as risks, not virtues. And still, millions of people shared the same unspoken feeling. This can't be all there is. But where could hope even come from anymore? Star Wars did not arrive as a revolution. There were no speeches declaring change, no critics predicting a cultural shift. It was marketed modestly, released cautiously, and treated by studios as a gamble at best. So how did something so underestimated manage to touch something so deep? The answer isn't found in box office numbers, at least not at first. It lives in the atmosphere of that moment, in the way people sat forward in their seats without knowing why, in the way children stared, silent, while adults felt something they hadn't felt in years, but couldn't quite name. Was it wonder or more recognition? For the first time in a long while, a story didn't mock belief. It didn't apologize for sincerity. It didn't dismantle the idea of good and evil. It reintroduced it. But was the world really ready to believe again? Or was it simply desperate enough to try? What most viewers didn't realize was that Star Wars wasn't just presenting a new universe. It was quietly offering permission. Permission to care deeply, to imagine boldly, and to take myths seriously again. And once that permission was granted, could it ever be taken back? Because something shifted that night. Not loudly, not instantly, but in the collective imagination of everyone who watched stars stretch into light for the first time. And whether they noticed it or not, the question had already been asked. If stories could make us feel this way again, what else might they change? And if Star Wars was only the beginning, what exactly did it set in motion? What happened after audiences walked out of the theater would reshape cinema, culture, and imagination itself, but no one was prepared for the scale of what was coming. The strange thing wasn't what people said after the movie ended. It was how urgently they said it, not with analysis, not with clever criticism, but with a kind of disbelief that demanded to be shared. Why did so many people leave the theater feeling like they had witnessed something they couldn't fully explain? There were no viral trailers, no social media reactions, no global marketing machine fine-tuned to manufacture hype. What followed was slower, more human, and far more powerful. People told other people, friends called friends, parents brought children, children dragged parents back again. And with each retelling, The experience grew larger than the film itself. But what exactly were they trying to pass along? At first, theaters didn't understand what was happening. Star Wars wasn't supposed to last. It wasn't expected to dominate screens for weeks, let alone months. Yet showtimes filled, lines formed early, audiences returned, sometimes multiple times, not to re-watch, but to re-feel. Why did one viewing suddenly seem insufficient? Theaters became gathering spaces again. Not places people passed through, but places they lingered. People talked in line. They argued about characters, repeated lines, replayed scenes from memory. Strangers shared something without needing an explanation. In an era defined by fragmentation and distrust, how did a movie create such immediate unity? This wasn't fandom as the world knows it now. There were no forums to gather in, no algorithms to feed obsession. The connection lived in conversations, in imagination, in absence. You couldn't rewatch scenes on demand. You had to hold them in your mind, replaying them imperfectly, emotionally, and somehow that made them stronger. But why did this particular story cling so tightly? Part of the answer lies in contrast. Star Wars didn't arrive alone. It arrived against something. Against cynicism. Against irony. Against stories that warned you not to believe too much. Instead, it spoke in an older language. Clear choices, moral gravity, sacrifice that mattered. Had audiences forgotten how much they missed that clarity? Critics struggled to frame what they were seeing. Was it nostalgia? Was it escapism? Was it childish fantasy dressed up with special effects? Those labels felt insufficient, even dismissive, because what was happening in theaters didn't feel like retreat. It felt like awakening. So why did so many observers underestimate it? Behind the scenes, the industry reacted slowly. Then, all at once, executives noticed something unusual. People weren't just buying tickets. They were reorganizing their lives around showtimes. They were treating a movie like an event, not a product. Had cinema always been capable of this? Or had something fundamentally changed? The idea of the blockbuster didn't begin as a strategy. It emerged as a response. A reaction to behavior no one had planned for. Studios had chased prestige, awards, critical approval, but suddenly they were watching raw momentum reshape the market in real time. If one film could do this, what would happen if others tried? Yet something deeper was unfolding beyond economics. For many viewers, Star Wars didn't end when the credits rolled. It followed them home. Children reenacted scenes with improvised props. Adults found themselves thinking about ideas they hadn't expected from a space fantasy. Destiny, choice, balance. Why did this story refuse to stay contained? Merchandise began to appear. Tentatively at first. Action figures, posters, lunchboxes, objects that extended the experience beyond the theater. This wasn't just consumption. It was participation. People weren't buying reminders. They were building worlds in their own spaces. When did storytelling stop being something you watched and start becoming something you lived? Communities formed without names for themselves. Schoolyards, living rooms, college dorms. Arguments over favorite characters. Debates over good and evil. Speculation about what might come next. In a time before sequels were guaranteed, imagination filled the gap. And in that gap, something remarkable happened. Audiences became co-creators. But did anyone realize the implications of that shift? What Star Wars created wasn't just demand. It created expectation. Not for spectacle alone, but for meaning wrapped in spectacle. Audiences now wanted stories that felt large, sincere, and emotionally anchored. And once that expectation exists, it doesn't quietly disappear. How could the industry ever return to what it was before? The ripple spread outward. Other filmmakers watched closely. Some felt inspired. Others felt threatened. A new standard had been set, even if no one had officially announced it. Cinema had been reminded of its oldest power, to create shared myths in a fragmented world. But myths once awakened tend to demand continuity. because one question lingered everywhere Star Wars went. Unspoken, persistent, impossible to ignore. If this story could make us feel united again, what happens when it grows? And growth was coming. Bigger audiences, bigger expectations, bigger risks, but also bigger consequences. What began as a single film was already transforming into something else, something expansive, something ongoing. And with that transformation came a new tension. Could Star Wars remain a source of wonder, or would the weight of its own impact begin to change it? As the phenomenon expanded, it didn't just reshape audiences. It forced Hollywood, technology, and storytelling itself to adapt. And not everyone would survive that transformation. Hollywood did not change overnight. It resisted first. Studios always do. They searched for ways to explain the phenomenon without admitting what it truly meant. Was Star Wars an anomaly or a warning? Executives studied charts, demographics, and weekend grosses. They tried to reduce the impact to numbers, trends, and formulas. If they could quantify it, they could control it. But how do you measure a shift in imagination? For decades, the industry had treated spectacle and meaning as opposing forces. Big movies were loud but shallow. Serious movies were quiet and complex. Star Wars disrupted that assumption without asking permission. It suggested that scale and sincerity could coexist. And once that idea entered the system, could it ever be removed? Technology was forced to evolve. Not gradually, urgently. The film demanded visuals that didn't yet exist, systems that hadn't been perfected, workflows no studio had standardized. In response, technicians, artists, and engineers became storytellers in their own right. Effects were no longer decoration. They were narrative infrastructure. But when tools shape stories, who is really in control? Sound changed too, not as background but as architecture. Engines roared with personality. Weapons carried emotional weight. Silence itself became part of the drama. Audiences didn't just watch Star Wars, they felt it physically. And once cinema engaged the senses this deeply, could it ever return to restraint? Studios took notes. They didn't just see success, they saw a blueprint. Bigger screens, louder sound, wider releases. Films became events, scheduled moments in cultural time, rather than passing entertainment. But events come with expectations, and expectations are heavy. The term blockbuster hardened into strategy. Release windows were redesigned. Marketing became front-loaded. Opening weekends transformed into verdicts. Suddenly, movies weren't given time to grow. They were judged immediately. Was this evolution or compression? As the industry chased the next Star Wars, something subtle shifted. Risk was encouraged, but only in one direction. Studios wanted spectacle without vulnerability, scale without sincerity. They wanted the shape of myth, not its soul. Could the system reproduce magic without understanding what created it? Meanwhile, filmmakers faced a new pressure. Audiences had tasted wonder again. They wanted immersion, coherence, worlds that felt lived in. Half measures no longer satisfied. Storytelling had to expand, not just in length, but in depth. World building became a requirement, not an option. But how much world is too much? The impact reached beyond film. Toy companies, publishers, television networks, and advertisers recognized the shift. Stories were no longer isolated experiences. They were ecosystems. Narratives stretched across formats, across time, across generations. What began as a film became a presence. And presence changes responsibility. With growth came tension. Art versus commerce. Myth versus product. Meaning versus momentum. Every expansion carried the risk of dilution. Could a story remain sacred once it became infrastructure? For audiences, the relationship evolved as well. They were no longer passive recipients. They analyzed, anticipated, debated. They felt ownership, not legally but emotionally. Star Wars didn't just entertain them, it accompanied them through life. But what happens when something that feels personal becomes global? The industry tried to catch up by building universes. Some succeeded, many failed. Because scale alone wasn't enough, Star Wars had thrived not because it was big, but because it was clear. Clear in its values, clear in its emotional center, clear in what it asked of its audience. Had Hollywood misunderstood its own lesson? As technology advanced, possibilities multiplied. Digital tools promise freedom, infinite worlds, limitless spectacle. But freedom can overwhelm as easily as it inspires. When everything is possible, what deserves to exist? Star Wars had opened a door, but walking through it required restraint, intention, and trust in the audience. Not every story was willing to make that leap, and not every studio was patient enough to let stories breathe. By the early 1980s, the transformation was undeniable. Cinema was louder, bigger, more ambitious, but it was also more fragile. One success could reshape the landscape. One failure could collapse it. And in the center of it all stood a question the industry still hadn't answered. Had Star Wars saved Hollywood, or had it set a precedent that nothing could safely follow? As the industry transformed, something even more powerful was forming. Not in boardrooms or studios, but among the people who refused to let the story end. Long after the theaters emptied, Star Wars remained, not as a memory but as a presence. It lived in conversations, in arguments, in quiet moments of imagination that had no obvious place to go. The story refused to fade. But why did people hold on to it so tightly? What emerged in the years that followed wasn't immediately recognized as something new. There was no name for it yet, no framework, just people, scattered, disconnected, discovering that they shared a language they hadn't known existed, a reference, a melody, a line of dialogue, and suddenly they were no longer strangers. How did a fictional galaxy become a social bond? Fans didn't gather around Star Wars because they were told to. They gathered because the story gave them room to imagine themselves inside it, room to project their fears, hopes, and values onto something larger than their daily lives. This wasn't admiration from a distance. It was identification. But what does it mean when a story feels personal to millions of people at once? Conventions began as modest affairs, small rooms, handmade costumes. People who had spent years feeling alone in their enthusiasm finally saw reflections of themselves. There was vulnerability in that visibility. Pride too. Star Wars didn't just offer entertainment, it offered belonging. And belonging changes how people protect what they love. Children grew up with the story. Then they carried it forward. They shared it not as nostalgia, but as inheritance. A parent sitting beside a child in front of a screen. A moment of anticipation before the opening music. A glance exchanged as if to say, "This matters." How many stories survive by becoming rituals? The mythology adapted itself to life stages. At first it was adventure. Then it became morality. Later, it turned reflective. About loss, balance, responsibility. Star Wars grew older alongside its audience. But could it age without fracturing? Because with emotional ownership came expectation. Fans didn't just want more. They wanted continuity. They wanted the story to honor what it had given them. And when it didn't, disappointment wasn't mild. It was personal. Why does disappointment hurt more when it comes from something we love? The story now existed in a delicate space. Too distant and it felt abandoned. Too controlled and it felt constrained. Too altered and it felt betrayed. Star Wars was no longer just telling a story. It was negotiating a relationship. And relationships are rarely simple. What made this fandom different wasn't just size. It was longevity. Trends rise and fall. Fandoms peak and fade. But Star Wars endured across decades, adapting without dissolving. The Force became metaphor. The conflict became philosophical. The galaxy became symbolic. But symbols evolve, and evolution invites conflict. Debates intensified. What counted as true Star Wars? Who had the authority to decide? Creators? Studios? Fans themselves? Ownership became emotional, not contractual. And emotional ownership resists compromise. Yet despite disagreement, the connection held. People returned, again and again, not because the story was perfect, but because it felt theirs. Star Wars had become a shared memory, even from moments people had never personally experienced. How does something fictional achieve the weight of lived history? The answer lies in community, in shared language, in repeated rituals, in collective imagination. Star Wars wasn't just remembered, it was maintained, kept alive through retelling, reinterpretation, and debate. A living myth requires caretakers, but caretakers don't always agree on how something should be preserved. As time passed, the story faced a challenge greater than any villain it had depicted: relevance. The world was changing faster, audiences were fragmenting, attention was splitting across endless platforms. Could a myth born in a different era still speak clearly? Because the galaxy had grown vast. Expansions, reinterpretations, reboots. Each edition risked altering the core, and with every alteration came a question that grew harder to answer. When a story belongs to everyone, who is responsible for protecting what it means? As Star Wars entered a new era of reinvention, the struggle was no longer about survival. It was about identity. By the time Star Wars entered its next phase, the world around it had changed beyond recognition. Technology accelerated, attention fragmented, audiences no longer gathered in the same places, at the same times for the same reasons. And yet, expectations for Star Wars had never been higher. How does a story remain universal in a world that no longer moves together? The decision to expand the galaxy again was inevitable. Silence would have been interpreted as abandonment, but continuation came with risk. Every new chapter carried the weight of everything that came before it. Nostalgia demanded reverence. Progress demanded reinvention. Could both coexist without tearing the myth apart? For some viewers, returning to Star Wars felt like coming home. Familiar sounds, recognizable symbols, echoes of stories that had shaped their identity. For others, those same elements felt restrictive, a refusal to evolve. The same scene could inspire comfort in one person and frustration in another. Why did the same myth now provoke such different reactions? The fracture didn't happen all at once. It spread quietly, through debates and disagreements that felt personal because they were personal. People weren't arguing about plot points. They were arguing about meaning, about what Star Wars had been to them. And when personal meaning collides with collective ownership, conflict is inevitable. Studios faced an impossible task. They weren't just producing stories. They were mediating memory. Every creative choice became symbolic. Every deviation felt intentional. Every repetition felt cautious. Innovation risked rejection. Familiarity risked stagnation. How do you move forward when every step offends someone? At the same time, a new generation was encountering Star Wars without the weight of history. They weren't protecting a memory. They were discovering a world. What older fans saw as deviation, younger viewers saw as entry. To them, this was not a legacy to defend, but a universe to explore. Who gets to decide which perspective matters more? Cultural context played its part. The world had become louder, more polarized, more reactive. Stories were no longer allowed to simply exist. They were expected to declare positions. Star Wars, once a shared myth, now entered a landscape where myths were contested territory. Could a story built on balance survive in an age of extremes? Social platforms amplified every reaction. Praise and outrage traveled at the same speed. Nuance struggled to survive in the space between them. Moments that once lived quietly in theaters now lived forever online, replayed and reframed. The conversation around Star Wars became as visible as the story itself, and visibility magnifies tension. Yet even in disagreement, engagement remained intense. People still cared. They argued because the story mattered. Apathy would have been the true end, but caring at scale brings exhaustion. The myth was no longer just inspiring imagination. It was absorbing emotional labor. Could it carry that burden indefinitely? Some creators leaned into reinvention. Others leaned into reverence. Some found new angles, quieter stories, smaller moments. They explored the edges of the galaxy rather than its center. In doing so, they reminded audiences that Star Wars had always been flexible. A framework, not a formula, but flexibility invites reinterpretation, and reinterpretation invites resistance. The question was no longer whether Star Wars could continue. It clearly could. The question was whether it could still unify, whether a story born to reconnect a fractured society could still function as common ground in a fragmented world, or whether its role had fundamentally changed. Perhaps Star Wars was no longer meant to be a single experience shared by everyone at once. Perhaps its new form was multiplicity, many entry points, many meanings, many connections. But if everyone experiences a different Star Wars, what holds the galaxy together? As the myth expanded outward, something became clear. Star Wars had outgrown the conditions that created it. It now existed in tension with its own influence. And that tension wasn't a flaw. It was evidence of impact, because only stories that matter deeply are argued over fiercely. Only myths that shape identity inspire this level of protection and resistance. And only cultural forces that endure long enough face the challenge of redefining themselves. The struggle was no longer about success. It was about purpose. So the question shifted one final time. If Star Wars can no longer be one thing to everyone, what is it now meant to be? As the galaxy continues to expand, one truth becomes unavoidable. Star Wars' greatest impact may not be what it created, but what it taught us about stories themselves. Long after the debates fade, after trends shift and technologies evolve, one question remains quietly present. Why does Star Wars still matter? Not as a franchise, not as a brand, but as an idea. Because when the noise settles, Star Wars reveals something rare. It never promised realism. It promised meaning. In a world increasingly defined by complexity, it offered moral clarity without pretending the journey was easy. And that promise continues to resonate, even when the form changes. But why does clarity feel so radical now? Star Wars didn't teach audiences what to think. It reminded them that stories could guide thinking. Through archetypes, symbols, and repetition, it revived the ancient function of myth, not to explain the universe, but to help people locate themselves within it. Heroism wasn't perfection. Evil wasn't abstract. Balance required effort, and choice always mattered. Why do those ideas persist across generations? Its greatest achievement may not be technological or commercial, but emotional literacy. Star Wars made vulnerability visible. Fear, anger, hope, attachment, loss. These weren't subplots. They were the engine. Audiences learned that strength without empathy collapses, and power without restraint corrodes. Lessons simple enough for a child, deep enough to follow into adulthood. How many stories manage that? The cultural legacy is everywhere, even when unnoticed. The language of modern blockbusters, the structure of cinematic universes, the expectation that spectacle should carry purpose, the belief that genre stories can hold serious meaning. Star Wars normalized the idea that imagination isn't escapism, it's preparation. Preparation for moral choice, for uncertainty, for complexity. Is it any wonder it refuses to disappear? Yet perhaps its most lasting impact is not on cinema, but on people. On the way generations learn to share stories across age, background, and belief. A parent explaining a scene, a child asking questions, a shared silence during familiar music. These moments outlive any single version of the story. They turn entertainment into memory, and memory into identity. Star Wars endures because it adapts, not by abandoning its core, but by allowing reinterpretation. It accepts that meaning is not fixed, that myths survive by being questioned, challenged, and retold. This flexibility is not weakness. It is how stories stay alive. But living stories ask something of us in return. They ask us to engage, not consume, to reflect, not react, to recognize that disagreement does not erase connection. Star Wars has become a mirror, not of the galaxy it depicts, but of the societies that interpret it. What we argue about reveals what we value, and what we protect reveals what shaped us. In that sense, Star Wars never belonged to a single era. It emerged from a moment of uncertainty. But uncertainty is not unique to the 1970s. Every generation encounters its own version of fragmentation, doubt and longing, and every generation searches for stories that help make sense of it. Star Wars simply proved that such stories are still possible. The galaxy far, far away was never meant to replace reality. It was meant to illuminate it, to suggest that even in vast systems beyond our control, individual choice still carries weight, that hope is not naive, that balance is worth striving for, even when it feels unreachable. Are those ideas ever truly outdated? Perhaps this is why Star Wars remains unfinished, not because it needs endless expansion, but because its purpose was never to conclude. It exists to be revisited at different moments in life, each time revealing something new, something previously overlooked, a different lesson, a different question, a different reflection of who we are. In the end, Star Wars did not change everything by accident. It changed everything by reminding people of something they had almost forgotten. That stories are not distractions from reality. They are tools for surviving it. And as long as societies continue to struggle with meaning, identity, and hope, as long as people continue to look for narratives that connect rather than divide, the impact of Star Wars will remain, not as a single story, but as a shared language. The galaxy will keep expanding. Interpretations will shift. Debates will continue. But beneath it all, one truth endures. Star Wars mattered not because it was perfect, but because it dared to matter at all. In a fractured world, Star Wars didn't offer answers. It offered orientation. And perhaps that's why, decades later, we're still looking to the stars.